Greetings to you once
Greetings.
again. Good to be here again with you, Brother Zamir.
Good to be here with you, Brother Ian.
Well, we are in our portion of our journey where we do a recap on our conversation yesterday with Bayo Akomolafe.
Yeah.
And I would say it did not disappoint.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're more prone to the understatement, and my overstatement would be, wow, it really blew my heart and mind open.
Well, I'd say Bayo has such a fantastic capacity to sort of wonder out loud in a way that, like, it's even hard to describe, right? Like, there's a certain, almost like pivoting or maybe queering, right, is a word that he's used, which is really to like sidestep ways of thinking that are, one didn't even know that were, the typical ways of thinking about or approaching something, and he'll just kind of like sidestep and string language together in such a way that really, I don't know, I feel like just ignites different neural pathways of understanding.
Right. You use this term when you were talking about Stephen Jenkinson and then coming into Bayo, which I really liked. I'd love you to tease it out a bit, which is this word, achieved wonder, as this wonder something to be achieved. I mean, how would you define that?
Well, this again goes back to, we'll probably touch into this, which probably is a quality of Sela, right? Which is something that we did touch on in the conversation, as well as a sort of kinship with yarning, which is something Tyson Young-Comporta talked about. But for me, actually, I think I'm starting to realize that these qualities that they seem to describe have qualities in what we're talking about. Like that, actually, this, essentially, it's not a debate. Again, it's not a sort of who's right. It's actually a question of like shared achievement together with oneself and the other, or with a group. That there's some it's closer to ritual. I believe ritual as a sort of relationship between a kind of structure and mystery, right? Which I think is the best real achieved ritual. And so I think that in these conversations, this is what we've been trying to do, is invite this relationship between structure. We have some sense of where we want to go, but also the mystery of inviting in, the divine in a way.
It's so interesting you use the word ritual, because my understanding is it comes from the Sanskrit rhythm, and rhythm is the root of the English word rhythm. And rhythm comes from a very ancient Sanskrit word or cognate now, which is called rita. And rita was referred to in the Rig Veda, and the rita is basically that which upholds the laws of nature. That there is this underlying support through which the ritual is intended to bring us into accord with this rhythm, that which upholds the principles of cosmos. And the word dharma or righteousness, or the teachings that that weave through all life, emerge out of this source, right? So it's almost, what it's cluing me into is a conversation is, we use the word truing into the beginning, right? Which is trying to bring us into accord with this invisible yet all-pervasive essence that when we touch it, we experience it as intrinsically a true or real, that aligns us to what is beneath the surface. And in that sense, a ritual is not like a dogmatic thing, or a ritual, we would say religious, but actually it's a human process whereby we connect to what is actually really moving things on the deeper level.
Again, this makes me think of contact, right? Which is, again, something that's come up now a few times, and something that I've been deeply sort of researching, and also still completely baffled by. There's something happens when contact is made, and there's a sort of truth of the contact. Again, if it's between people with differing perspectives on many things or certain things, one can still find contact within that. And it's not the same as agreement, right? It's not like saying, oh, okay, I agree with your worldview. But if you can connect with the truth of it between you, and again, truing, to me, again, is such a valuable skill in this time. Some of the truing that I think happened within the conversation, it's so challenging. I'm going over my notes as well, and they're all like these little pathways and gateways into like whole ecosystems of different understandings. But one that really stood out for me is this line that poetry is about prophecy.
Mm.
Or even he said, poetry is the language of apocalypse. I was like,
and what is the word apocalypse, but actually that which removes the veil?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's an interesting way of thinking of the word.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the ability to, I think, use language in such a way that you can approach a sort of mythic substructure, I think is so important too, because I think again, a sort of rational, intellectual, scientific paradigm feels so devoid of that layer. And I think that's what so much people are craving for, right? This sense of the capacity to make meaning, right, of this moment in a fashion that just seems thin, based on this dominant narrative of, again, it's a virus, we got to win this war. And he was able to really open up so many ways of understanding this moment, of which I'm really grateful for.
Yeah, actually, I just reached across to grab my phone where I had some notes going into the conversation. And there's a line that I think speaks to what you're doing and what, Bayo seems to be so skilled at. And he says, for there are perhaps only two ways of responding to a question. One, with an answer that offers closure within the same economy of meaning. And two, with bewilderment, which releases the question from its self-incarceration within its own world. Right. And he seems to do this emancipation of the question itself, right, from the incarceration of the meaning that it was enclosed in. And that's what I feel the mainstream discussions and dialogues have only kept it incarcerated. And that's what people are feeling stifled, that we can only talk about it within the paradigm and the language and the logic that is confined within the question. And here he's helping to show what it looks like and feels like to bewilder us with the emancipation of the question.
I like that. Into the bewilderment is what came. One of the things that I've really stuck with me as well is articulation of this pandemic or this happening as a miracle, right? And if you recall that moment as well, I mean, it's sort of a, it could be really volatile to use that kind of language around this happening, because of course there's a lot of suffering, right? There's a lot of harm around it. And I think people tend to think of miracle as, again, something beneficial, right? It's a miracle. Something went in my favor, let's say. But the way he talked about miracle was, I thought, pretty interesting, which is the sense of a miracle is something which interrupts the flow of regular scheduled programming, right? Is sort of the one way I took from it. And that itself, that intervention in a way, especially at a time like this too, when there's a clear momentum towards deep biospheric collapse and climate change and all the rest, that there is a deep sense of, well, like how do we get off this train, right? And that he's a line, I think, from the essay as well, was this the disruption we prayed for, but didn't want to recognize when it arrived, right? And again, it's always fraught too, because right, that it somehow seems to possibly try to dismiss again all the suffering and all the harm that's happening. But he kind of relinquished or sort of reined that racing off with the sense of, look, I mean, even right now, I mean, there's so many, I think he called them networks of suffering, right, that people partake in largely still unawares, because that is how the global economic system works, by essentially hiding these networks of suffering. And this existed obviously prior to the pandemic, and now we're seeing perhaps more clearly in some ways, and in other ways not.
Yeah, I feel that language of miracle was kind of new to me. It took me a little to adjust to that, to see it in that way. Definitely in the way that he's described it, certainly it is a disruption, and it's a reframe of how we could look at this. And I think if we treat it in the way that he spoke to, which is with the capacity of a child to play with a thing. And so even just playing with the idea of looking at it like that, we can see new things, right? I mean, he sort of spoke to this in another line in the essay, which I really liked, which we didn't exactly say these words, but he said, Remember the human eye looking through a specific type of microscope to view a microbe. Remember that we're not actually looking at the microbe as if we've been granted unspoiled access to the microbe as it really is beyond material contingencies. It's actually getting a long-winded, but hope you're following.
Mm-hmm.
He says, we are co-creating / co-manufacturing an image. Seeing is a strategy, a co-production across heterogeneous bodies, right? So, seeing is a strategy. So if we employ a strategy of like, okay, we're going to look at this happening as a miracle, then what could we see, right? I mean, seeing it as a war is also a co-production amongst many different bodies, political bodies and, economic bodies and medical bodies, which is the strategy by which we are co-opting the view of a thing. And then we respond to it in such a way, right? So, even the playfulness to step outside, and sometimes that can be taboo when people are very attached to the way in which the agreed upon way to see a thing is. And then it brings up a whole kerfuffle, like how could you look at it in such a way? But, poetry and this kind of bewilderment gives license to look at it in that way. And when we do, we can have new possibilities emerge, right?
This made me think of how he described the medicine of the trickster, right? And he talks about it in his essay at length, right? He sort of parallels it with the cosmology of the god Ishu, I believe the name was, in the Yoruba tradition, which he comes from, and recognizing what is the medicine of the trickster to upend, to shift perspectives, to mess with maybe a kind of direct linear causality, right? And I'm actually remembering a little of the conversation with Tyson where, I think I brought up the forest fires at one point right in Australia, and the sense of, the early days of the pandemic, like this forest fire, the mass forest fire down there had, erupted, and that basically characterized most of January, it felt. And then all of a sudden we were into the pandemic. And I mean, he really queered my sort of causality there, though, too, or at least the frame by which, quote, when did that begin, though? Is that when it began, right? When the fire caught, or did it actually begin? I mean, I think he spoke to, like other environmental degradation and choices that were made, politically and economically by the current regime to make the conditions susceptible to something like the forest fire happening.
Right.
And so, so again, the sense of, like if I draw a box around something and say, that's the beginning, that's the middle, that's the end, I'm not be able to see these vast array of maybe subjectivities, right, that are quite different than the lens that I would bring as someone conditioned into a certain way of seeing.
Well, here's where things can get really interesting in this arena, which is, let's say we apply this to the mainstream narrative of the pandemic, like, well, it came from a wet market, and now people are looking at it. Well, actually, it came from a lab, and where did that start? Well, investment into gain of function research, and from where did that begin? Right. And then you start going down and then a whole series of theories. Some are considered to be conspiracy theories. Some, I don't know, depends on wherever you land on the scale. But there's all these conjectures from where things begin and why, and the linkages that point to them. Right. And so here's where the territory gets very fraught, and necessarily fraught. We can't discount the importance of doing this kind of digging further back and the radical subjectivity in the process. Because if we decide, well, it's too fraught with danger, well, then you label these people as disinformation people, and you're not allowed to talk about this, and you can't point to that because that's too dangerous, right? So there's a tremendous responsibility in what he calls this sort of post-activism, which is, if we're going to really delve into this subject matter, what is the responsibility of seeking out the differing narratives, the subjective, trails of possibility of origination of an event, right? That's where I feel a great deal of responsibility in myself, and I know you do as well, to do this, because otherwise you can cause a lot of confusion. I
think it might be important too to mention again this different way of seeing. I think he had this phrase is something like there's only, or messing with the idea that there's only one way to be a self, right? And he was linking out to the sense of a sort of modern atomized individual, like that's the recognition of what it means to be a self, like a discrete, individual, sort of here's where I begin and there's where I end, which is sort of a modern invention, right? And not just him as saying that, but that's something that has been sort of becoming more known in sense, right? There's lots of other ways to perceive and to experience oneself, like as a deeply relational being, in terms of where reciprocity is granted, again, to lots of sources. I mean, the land, to one's own ancestry, people, like those pathways or those relations are seen as deeply consequential to one's ability to, quote, be themselves, right, in certain cultures. And in other individualistic, deep individualistic cultures, right, one is very seen as solitary and it's only accrues to me. And so that alone as well was a kind of really a blooming of other possibility. And this also brings to mind to me of like, what is health then, right? Because again, if one conceives of health as only occurring to themselves as a discrete individual, that's a certain understanding of things, right? But if one expands that sense of what is health and our deep intimacy with the ecosystems around us, for example, right, then we start to recognize, oh, wait a second, yeah, I can't conceive of health only recurring to just myself or even just the human realm, right? And this is to me that interrelationality, which feels is so much a part of the kind of message, I think, of the moment, right? Like to really awaken to this deep relationality that requires a real, like a querying of one's cling or grip on one's own sense of self and health. Because the last thing I'll say is that I think so much of the conversations that are happening at a sort of surface level, and certainly in the polarization in social media, especially, really it is sort of missing the layer. I think what's at stake is one's own sense of safety, right? At like really a deep layer, like a deep somatic layer. And I see the pro-vax side is really, it comes from this understanding that the way to create safety or experience safety is to get everybody vaccinated as soon as possible. Right? Like that's the narrative that is put forth. That's where safety comes from, right? And so if there's unvaxxed people not going along with the program, they're messing with their sense of safety. But then on the unvaxxed side, of course, they're going like, I don't want to take this, experimental gene therapy. So you're really messing with my sense of safety, like trying to control me into taking this thing. And so both sides are deeply sort of, and I think unconsciously bound with trying to seek safety within the narratives that seem to grant it. And so again, it's really hard to see it, I think, unless we're able to expand and to be able to see from these multitude of perspectives.
Mm. Well, one thing that came out in that talk with Bayo was right by the end of it, that it appears that outside of the, commonly characterized polarization between a vaxxed and unvaxxed, and there is a deeper abiding sense of mistrust that many people carry towards institutions that are whether it's political or economic or medical institutions that don't take the time to address or even question the nuance, or to question one's relationship or responsibility to forget the non-human world, but even to many other sectors of society that would otherwise be impacted by decisions that are made. So, for example, we were talking about how in many ways it felt that the needs of the children were largely under discussed in terms of our response to the virus, the needs of small businesses, the needs of the poor, like all these sectors of society that are in many sort of mainstream capitalist models are considered to be externalities of decisions that will be taken care of somehow by social service sectors, or people who make it their job to take care of these things. And so recognizing this sort of callousness that is made within this sort of hierarchical capitalist structure, and those that have the power to make these decisions there's this deep in distrust saying like, whatever you decide, I know is not taking into account many of these things that I value and that I would take the time to discuss about. So when you propose a solution, I'm already at a place where I'm like, yeah, I don't really trust your intention. I don't think you've done the work so that you really can make a decision that is going to take this into account. And all these things are subconsciously playing in to people's decision to, make a choice to vaccinate or not vaccinate, or to allow their children to receive it or not, or to go with masking or not masking or lockdowns, irrespective of, let's take the science discussion out of it, because that could get us sort of, clouded in a whole other world. But this kind of came out of our conversation with Bayo towards the end.
Well, he had another line too, which maybe I think gets at the heart of I guess in some sense, almost like not what's at stake, or what's needs to be part of it, which is, I think he said, we're not going to make it, right? And it sounds a bit fatalistic, I think, in some ways, but I the way I took it, and we spent a bit of time on it, was we're not going to make it as we were, right? And that's the deep sort of seduction, I think, that is so much a part of the governmental political response, is sort of like, here's how we can get back to what we had as quick as possible, right? And there's a deep necessity, I think, for that to truly be different, actually, because of this, and to be reorganized in such a fashion that it actually is different than the trajectory that we're on right now. And I mean, like you said, if there's not really a sense of that this real work has been done. I mean, just parallel over what's happening at COP26, and I think the deep frustration that's going on with a lot of people saying, here's the world leaders again meeting and again not really doing anything significant. That there's the deep sense, like, what's it going to take? And so, I'm excited by future conversations as well that we're having here, particularly to look at what kind of possible future organizational pathways, like how would society look, right, if it actually was willing to be changed by this, right? Not by just this, but by this as a initiatory moment into a fundamental different way of organizing that embodies the certain values that I think, many people are longing for. But we have institutions, we have structures that are based upon an old story, again, like an older understanding of what it means to be a self, what is important, right? What is valued, and that's the gap I see with a lot of people, right? How to essentially embody both personally and individually, but then interface with the legacy systems and structures that I think absolutely need to change.
Well, you brought up this fascinating movie in the talk, Arrival, which is a movie that I love as well. And I'd like you to tease out a little bit more why it's been coming back to you in this process of doing it. And before I hand it over, returning back to this notion of a miracle, my teacher, she says a miracle is a changed consciousness. Okay. So, a layer on top of the miracle that Bayo has spoken of here, I think a miracle to emerge out of this with the pandemic would be, people whose consciousness truly changes through the process of undergoing this kind of initiatory event, which is, how do we see how we see? What is it that's going on underneath the surface that makes us respond either in a state of fear or with a state of possibility, right? How do we understand the notion of what health is, right? I mean, there's many possibilities that are being brought up by this pandemic that could, given deep inquiry and a collective inquiry support even, could actually result in a change in consciousness. Not with everybody. We're not talking about mass enlightenment or anything. We're just talking about expanding your perception to include more than what it was capable of including previously. That's the expansion, right? That's your own personal access to what flows through this, how it relates and how it perceives to life. I mean, that alone would be quite remarkable. And I know that in the Arrival film, that was sort of what in some way was evoked, right? I mean,
Well, I'd love to touch on that too, but I don't want to lose the thread too that you shared,
Yeah.
which is, I mean, even tracking through some of the conversations we've had now, like the possibilities that have emerged in, for example, like Tyson saying, I think he spoke about his older kids, like he wasn't really around for them, but he had I think it was a new child, or at least youngers around him, that through the pandemic, right, he had to stay home a lot of the time, and all of a sudden he's like, wow, I'm really enjoying actually being a parent, with these kids. And there are a lot of stories, right, where people will say things like, oh, I didn't know, I just don't need to go to the office. Like, as in I can actually, create a creative space, say, elsewhere, or even areas where full decisions made of like, wait, what I'm doing, I don't even really like what I'm doing, like say for work. And so deciding to, shift gears or become
The
more
great
aligned.
resignation.
Well, exactly that. Yeah. And realizing again, like how much of labor effort within, again, if you look at a system of human energy, right, as a resource, how much of that energy is actually going towards pretty useless endeavors? Move this rock over here, move this rock over here, or even like service jobs as well. That again, I mean, it's sort of cliche that they don't provide soul, deepening sort of value or effort, of oneself. And so again, go back to this question. It's like so much of what we're doing is actually not that useful, and not many people really like it. I mean, but why is it there? Of course, because economic value is siphoned up towards the quote elite, which I'm not saying again that they made the system. I mean, they're certainly inheriting from it and making decisions to benefit from it, but it is like it's a self-conjuring thing. You remove one percenter, and then like another one takes their place, unless the system itself changes. So I think that there's a real necessity, like you're saying, of this. What is the possibilities now, not instead of the misery and the harm, right? But realizing that, just like the skies clearing over the town, in India, and seeing the mountains for the first time, right? Like all of these glimpses of what's possible. Airlines being grounded, the world over, which of course a month before that would have been unthinkable. That the political will would have been there to say, okay, wait, let's ground them all. And it's possible. Like, so that to me really broke that spell of like, well, we just couldn't do that. But actually it's like, no, wait a second, we could overnight.
Well, while we were wearing masks, the whole planet took a breath. Think of it that way. Truly.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So this then gets me to Arrival, and maybe this will be our last little nugget before we close the recap. But again, if you haven't seen the film, I highly, highly recommend it. It came out a few years ago. It's the same director as the new Dune, actually, which I didn't realize until.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's a French-Canadian director, I think.
Go Canada.
And so in that film as well, there's essentially an arrival of these other beings that are mysterious, and the human attempt to make contact with, is stymied. And I think it's been a while since I saw the film, but they may have started by, guns blazing, trying to, neutralize the threat or whatever, but nothing happened. And essentially what emerges though is that they really try to make contact with this other, and a somewhat of a puzzle starts to emerge. And somehow I think it's the female protagonist understands that to crack the puzzle, there's multitude of these beings that have arrived on the planet, right, in different sort of centers.
12 of them, I think, right?
Okay, yeah. And so the humans actually have to make contact with each other to have each piece to assemble and to like decrypt the message and the language that these beings are trying to offer. And again, that strikes me very similar to this moment, right? That, I mean, the benevolent story there is that humans, like again, the medical pharmaceutical industry might say, yeah, we've done that. Humans all work together to create a number of these vaccines, which is actually, that's the gift, right? That we were actually able to work together in record time and create these vaccines. And, from that perspective, maybe they're not wrong. Like that's in some ways a mass achievement of, both economic and working together, right? In some ways. And yet it's also built upon a commodified, profit-driven, I think I saw Moderna or Pfizer or something was like charging other countries 40 times the amount it took, and it was publicly funded. So just a bunch of ridiculous,
Well, to throw in one thing briefly, and I know we want to end soon, but Thomas Friedman, he wrote a book on globalization, and he had this golden arches theory of conflict resolution. And basically, he did this theory, and he was accurate that no two countries with McDonald's will go to war with each other, right? So there is a notion that there is that economic interdependence, true interdependence, could potentially offset our warring impulses and increase and foster collaboration because it's overriding national interests. Something for us to pick up in another call, I think, maybe. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I have curiosities about that, but I think what comes to me is again, like, I do think cooperation en masse is absolutely vital. Like, that seems pretty necessary. And if we're talking about climate change as this sort of existential threat now that has arisen, I would say because of the lack of coherence amongst these pods of humans, not all of them, of course, but the modern industrial ones, has now given rise to this, massive feedback loop. And so the invitation here is to come to a greater level of cooperation and coherence, to participate in this. And the challenge, or the nervousness that I have, and perhaps many others have as well, is it's the same language around climate change that is also being used, right? Like this war against climate change, or this kind of this language of frontliners, and so it's like, again, it's responding to this, which is actually a feedback loop of interdependence as a threat, like outside, and so I worries me again of not seeing the deeper invitation into a different kind of coherence, right? Which doesn't erase uniqueness, or doesn't erase diversity, which I think absolutely has to be at the forefront, right? Resiliency comes through diversity. It doesn't come from monoculturing everything. Again, this may be some of the things we'll get into in the conversations in the future, but I'll say, the conversation ended with Bayo as this word came up of post-activism, right? Which I think you were stoked to hear. And this invitation to go into the cracks, I think, right, was a strong image that, as this sort of globalized slave ship, is what he called it, as the cracks are appearing because of this happening, that, are we rushing around to like fix the holes and say, yeah, so we can keep paddling, right? Or is there a different kind of invitation that's present?
Wonderful. Well, Michael meet next week.
Yeah, Michael meet next week. So going into deep mythology, looking forward to that. So please check us out. If you're tuning in, go to gatheringofstories.com/pandemic. All the previous conversations are available to view, as well as the recaps. And you can join us for, again, our upcoming one happening next week.
Yeah, and check out the Facebook group. You can just join that at any time, and we post up recaps. We post outtakes of all the different talks out there, so you can get snippets of what's shared and stay abreast. And there's a good community of people talking about these things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, until next time, brother.
Bye.